We often overlook what happened on the MSX when talking about early retro gaming. And that's a shame, because this budget home computer platform was where a lot of game companies experimented with designing games around the home market instead of the arcade one. And if there's one series that perfectly encapsulates a company making their shift from arcade-style gaming to something better experienced at your leisure at home, then it's the Knightmare trilogy, a series of games Konami put out on the MSX that drastically changed genre and perspective with each entry. The second entry, The Maze of Gallius, might be one of the most important games that Konami put out on the system, standing toe-to-toe with another series that most people now are more familiar with, Metal Gear. But today, we are focusing on the first entry of this series, the original Knightmare. In Knightmare, you play as Popolon, a knight traveling across the lands to save Princess Aphrodite from the evil priest Hutness. It's kind of a throwaway plot for there to be a video game, but then again, this is an arcade-style game released in 1986, made by 5 people in under half a year. You don't need a story so much as you need a concept to easily get behind, and I quite like the game's concept, since it does come back to the gameplay. With the premise, you'd expect an action platformer or an adventure game, maybe even a beat-em-up. But instead, the original Knightmare is a vertical scrolling shmup. Most shmups released around this time, you'd play as a spaceship or a dogfighting airplane during one world war or another. Instead, you're a knight walking on the ground, constantly moving forward, with obstacles that get in your way that you have to dodge. It's not just enemies and bullets that you need to be careful about. Popolon can't swim. And it's not just that touching water just immediately ends the game or anything, it's more like a hard barrier that you have to navigate around before the invisible walls of the water and the auto-scrolling crush you between them. I like to imagine that Popolon is in such a rush he can't stop moving, so unless he does something about it, he rushes right into the rivers he's supposed to cross. Either way, it's a bit of gameplay weirdness. You're probably not supposed to think too much about it. Enemies come in a lot of shapes and, well, mostly the same size. We've got bats, knights, slime monsters, clouds that drop down towards you if you hit them, these other bat-like things, skeletons, ghosts, these other ghosts, weird demon things that often appear as those clouds at first. They all have their own distinct behavior and movement patterns. Slimes kind of just blunder forward. Knights try to confront you, blocking your path as they charge forward. Bats fly around in group formations in an arc. Ghosts jump at you from out of the walls. The fantasy theming is very nicely kept with the enemy roster. You could almost make an RPG out of this setting and enemy roster. Really makes you think. Of course, this being a shmup, there's a lot of power-ups. The way they appear kind of reminds me of Twinbee, another Konami game that was originally released a little while ahead of this game. Power-ups appear in these black orbs that fall towards you. There are 2 types of these, one to change your weapon type and another for passive power-ups. If you shoot these orbs enough times, you start cycling through the possible pickups, similar to Twinbee's bells. The weapons one lets you switch between your puny arrow to a much nicer double arrow, a fireball spread, a very nicely spammable knife, a more penetrative arrow, and a boomerang. If you get some of these a second time, you power them up. Kind of like how the double arrow acts as a stronger regular arrow. Personally, I quite like having the double knife, since you can spam the knife like crazy, and the double form gives it a nice spread. Besides the weapons, there's the power-up orb. Pick it up while it's green and you get a speed boost. I quite like being on movement 2 or 3, but anything beyond that and I'm likely to just run straight into enemies. It's a bit like how in Gradius and other shmups, you only want so many speed items before it becomes more of an obstacle than it helps you. Pick it up while it's blue, and you get a shield. Shields block incoming projectiles, but only from the front. If a bullet hits you from the side or back, you're still dead. It doesn't protect you from enemies crashing into you either, so it's useful, but not all powerful. It breaks after a while as well. The white power-up turns you into a ghost. This makes you invulnerable to enemy hits. So if you've got a shield and the movement speed upgrades you want, then the white power-up is the one you'll be shooting for. Right behind it is the red power-up, which makes you hot to the touch. It's kind of like the ghost power-up, it makes you invulnerable. except now you do damage by bumping into enemies while losing out on your projectile attacks. I wouldn't go so far as to call this one useless, but shooting is very important beyond just fighting enemies, so it's usually not that great to have. Shooting also breaks open boxes on the ground. These usually give score items, sometimes they also give nothing. Every now and again they'll also give a screen nuke item, which is very nice to find. Or a time stop, where I'm honestly not sure why it's here, or why the timer is this long. An interesting note is that the item boxes are hard-coded, so the same items are always in the same locations. There's no randomness going on with them. Sometimes the boxes open up a bridge so you can cross the river, which is kind of surprising seeing a shmup this simple end up using that as a mechanic. You'd almost respect it. Until you remember that a lot of game designers back in these days were goblins playing cruel tricks on unsuspecting players. Imagine invisible item blocks. Imagine them appearing around the same areas of the map as enemies are spawning, blocking your shots while they can move freely through these things. Imagine a river blocking your path with no box to shoot open a bridge in sight. That box is out there. It's invisible. Enemies will not stop spawning to let you figure out where it is safely before the auto-scrolling kills you. Good luck! The scrolling is fairly choppy. The MSX couldn't handle smooth scrolling. And it wasn't the kind of platform like the NES where technical limitations of the platform could be bypassed by loading up extra chips in each cartridge to make the system seem a lot more capable than it really was. This is why a lot of the popular MSX titles didn't feature any screen scrolling, instead making you move from screen to screen, room to room. The choppiness is pretty bad, but it is consistent enough that you can get used to it. It's hard to fault a game for its system's hard limitations, especially when it was clearly made in mind with them. The game isn't infinitely scrolling forward though. When you get to the end of a level, there's a boss waiting for you. The bosses are kind of interesting. It feels like quite a lot of thought went into their design and movement patterns, more so than in that of the normal enemy placements. Bosses often have a very simple habit of moving in particular ways while doing something non-standard with projectiles, like how the first boss tries to align herself with you while shooting lightning beams in your direction, and cloud enemies float around her to make it harder to get a clear shot, since clouds come crashing down towards you if you hit them, making it harder to find a safe moment to shoot at her. Or the Grim Reaper boss of Stage 2, who somehow just randomly kills you for no reason sometimes. Oh, wait, hold on. Every version of standard Knightmare 1 that I could find on every emulator that I tried it with would not properly display its attacks. For some reason, only playing the MSX2 re-release of the game, released much later, made them show for me. The Grim Reaper boss throws these swirling sights that can be difficult to avoid until you get used to them. You can actually shoot them down, which makes the fight even more interesting, because if you have a slow projectile, it becomes hard to counter this. An interesting design choice is that boss health doesn't reset when you die. Usually in the game, when you die during a stage, you get reset to a checkpoint. These checkpoints tend to be very close to where you died, but near the last power-up to help you start rebuilding since you lose all your weapons and speed upgrades on death. During boss fights, you don't get these back, but any damage done to the boss sticks between attempts. They can also be quite brutal, especially if you lost your power-ups, so it's a nice consideration. And at least you start with 25 lives. Okay, you originally start with 3 lives, but using the famous Konami code, you can make that 25 instead. You know the Konami code, right? Holding left, right, and select together at the same time while starting the game. Yeah, the Konami code. It practically feels mandatory to use this to get through the game with how difficult it is to get past stage 2. And this is coming from someone who never really saw the point to using it in Contra on the NES. When the enemies really start working to overwhelm you, popping up in increasingly large numbers, annoying combinations, and in the middle of hidden blocks, the game gets very tough. Though, there is another consideration here that is especially interesting. The game has secret exits to skip to later stages. By itself, that's not all that interesting. A lot of games really loved using secret exits on their stages. It had been a thing for a while. Super Mario Bros. Actually was not the first game to start doing this, but it was the one that made it especially popular to start searching for them for us in the West. But Knightmare just has to do it a little different compared to most games at the time. They only appear if you've cleared the stage that you're warping away from. So, if you've been to stage 3, you can take the secret exit in stage 1 to advance to stage 2, and then take the exit there to get to stage 3, skipping the majority of the obstacles along the way. The way it's handled feels more like how modern games often implement shortcuts, where they're designed to allow you to go back and forth between areas you've been to faster, or, in the case of something like a Souls game, to get back to where you died to continue your quest without having to retake the entire journey to get there. It's also very clearly intended as a shortcut system because they stop appearing past the first half of the game. They're just there to get you back to the second half in a shorter time. It's fascinating to see something so elegant in a clunky 1986 vertical shooter on a computer, but this is a very surprising game. Like, the catchy background music you're hearing in this video, there's 2 people credited with the sounds of this game online. One is Yoshinori Sasaki, who likely did the sound effects. Considering his other credits, he's usually a sound director, programmer, or producer. Apparently he's had a hand in both Resident Evil Revelations titles, multiple versions of Snatcher including the Sega CD version, and he was a producer for the PlayStation 2 version of E6, The Ark of Napishtim. But that's not the biggest surprise here. The music is by Miki Higashino, whose works most people have probably heard in Gradius, or Contra 3, or Suikoden, and several other fairly well-known titles. These are surprisingly big names for such a small game. You might not be familiar with Knightmare and wonder why this looks so familiar, and there's a good reason for this too. There's an NES game by Squaresoft under the name King's Knight. It was very clearly their attempt to get a clone game of a proven hit out on a popular system with sales overseas. Something they also did when they released 3D World Runner on the NES, a very obvious attempt to get some of that Space Harrier money away from Sega's home turf. Knightmare itself wouldn't release in the US, only seeing a major release in Japan and Europe, since Europe had a sizable MSX audience. It must have done well enough for Konami because of that aforementioned MSX2 version released years later. It's because of this version that I could actually beat the game, because Knightmare is extremely difficult. When you reach stage 3, the gloves come off, and by stage 5 the game starts beating a dead horse. The dead horse being you, the player. As the game starts burning through your lives with some very frustrating enemy combinations mixed with blocks getting in the way of your shots. The MSX2 version comes with an easy mode that actually does something I was thinking would make the game a lot more manageable when I was playing the original version. Instead of dying in one hit, your player sprite loses a bit of color every time you take damage, stripping Popolon of his armor as if he's Arthur from Ghouls and Ghosts. So you can take 3 hits before going down, making the stages a lot more manageable. The extra lives cheat works on top of this too, so you can tank those 3 shots 25 times before you go game over, instead of just dying after 3 hits. I don't think I would have made it through stage 7 without this mode. Stage 7 is where you're trapped on a bunch of bridges, searching for hidden boxes to open up more of the path. Parts of the stage are just incredibly cheap, with multiple fake partially connected segments that have nothing to do with where the actual hidden passage is. Easy mode also scrolls the screen a little slower, so there's more time between the enemy spawns. You can also walk over a lot of the boxes you couldn't before, so they don't get in your way anymore. I don't think they had to go this far. The health system was enough to make the game a lot more manageable. But at the same time, I still nearly went game over in this mode, so maybe I shouldn't say what is and isn't doable. The game is just very, very hard. The MSX2 version also comes with revamped sprites that have some more color, but I don't know, I kind of like the original blue armor more. Thankfully, you can turn the original sprites back on if you prefer them. I actually recorded my easy mode playthrough using the newer sprites. This way it's easier to tell which footage is from when I was a cheating hack. So, do I recommend Knightmare? Hard to say, really. If it looks fun to you, then I'd say go for it. But I think for a lot of people, this might be too difficult and frustrating at times. It is a mid-80s arcade-style shmup made by Konami designed for an 8-bit home computer, and it shows. A lot of the time you get that fun experience of feeling like you can no longer fight back because you died once and lost all your upgrades. I know this is a deal breaker for a lot of people when it comes to old shooters. But it's also a game that you can get through in under an hour on easy mode if you know what you're doing. Also, one of the better MSX emulators is actually browser-based, and there are sites hosting the game files that let you just play them in your browser. So there's almost no setup required if you want to give this game a spin. Just be sure to rebind the select key to something easy to press if you want to use the 25 lives cheat. Next time we're looking at a Knightmare title, we'll be looking at Konami's first attempt at an exploration-based action-adventure platformer taking place inside of a castle. And there will be no Vanias involved in this one. Anyway, I asked people on Patreon an important question. This time, shmups, vertical or horizontal? Horizontal won, and I'm not entirely surprised by that, considering I'd pick that myself too. I've really gotten into Cave's output. Maybe in the past I would have chosen vertical because I really like Gradius and Darius. But yeah, Cave has really won me over with horizontal shmups. Also, one last note, there was no good upload of the Knightmare soundtrack on YouTube, so I fixed that. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting the channel on Patreon as well as channel members. If you'd like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp or join on YouTube, and I will see ya!